My mother stole my college fund to pay for her fourth wedding, so I got revenge at her ceremony, and she ended up arrested that same day. My mother stole my college fund to pay for her fourth wedding, so I got revenge at her ceremony, and she ended up arrested that same day. I lost my grandmother when I was 18. She was a strong, straightforward woman who ran her own upholstery business for 5 decades and raised 3 children, with my mother being the middle child. They often clashed. When I was younger, I used to see my grandmother and my mother arguing over small things and wondered why, until I realized my grandmother hated my mother because of me. For context, according to my aunt, my parents never really wanted me. They resented me from the moment I was born. During the first 6 months of my life, I lived with my grandmother and aunt. However, as I grew older, my grandmother forced my parents to take responsibility. As a child, I remember my parents calling me numerous derogatory nicknames, especially my father, like Bimbo or Dumbo, whenever I made a small mistake. It was very painful to hear. Ironically, despite these labels, I turned out to be the most academically inclined among my cousins, thanks to my grandmother's encouragement. From a young age, I developed a passion for pursuing a career in science. My parents used to hit me for reasons that seemed trivial, like wearing nail polish or talking to a boy. My father wouldn't let me wear makeup, disapproved of tight clothing, even yoga pants with a long t-shirt, and basically anything associated with being a girl. Keep in mind, I was still growing up, and his controlling nature affected me deeply. Whenever my parents fought, it somehow always seemed to be my fault. On top of everything else, my mother constantly complained that I didn't contribute around the house. The reality was that from a very young age, I was taught to help. I folded at least 2 loads of laundry daily, cleaned one of the bathrooms every day, washed the dishes, and took care of other chores like sweeping the floors. Despite all this, I never complained, but my parents never appreciated it. I felt like I was nothing but garbage in their home. Back then, I did most things my parents told me to and avoided anything they didn't mention. I stayed away from drinking, kept clear of drugs, and made sure not to wear clothes they considered provocative. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to hang out with friends even for birthdays, nor were they allowed to visit our home. Sometimes, I made up excuses to stay longer at school during the day because I enjoyed spending time with others outside the confines of my home. However, everything changed when my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Even though I hated my father for always trying to control my life, I still didn't want him to die. But my mother clearly didn't feel the same way. She left my father, saying she didn't want to stay with a sick husband. My father and I were shocked when we saw her packing her things and leaving. Later, my father collapsed, sitting on the porch. Even though I was only 14, I could understand his pain. I always saw him sitting and having a beer on the porch when he had a bad day. So when I heard him crying, I brought him a beer from the fridge. My father started sobbing when he noticed I was giving him the beer and realized I was trying to comfort him in the only way I knew how. From that day on, I don't know how or why, but everything changed between him and me. He was no longer rude or abusive to me. I'd even dare to say he became a good father. After my mother left, my parents divorced in the following weeks, which was easy since my father had a prenuptial agreement with her, and she couldn't get any alimony. By the next month, my mother had already moved in with her new boyfriend, who was apparently her high school sweetheart, Morty. During this time, my mother resented having me on weekends. Whenever my father dropped me off, she'd come up with excuses about why she couldn't see me that weekend. It really hurt because it felt like my mom had divorced me along with my dad. Through all this, my grandmother kept visiting me, and I loved spending time with her. Once a month, she'd call me and all my cousins over for a sleepover at her house, which remains one of my favorite memories to date. 5 months after my parents' divorce, my mom, of course, got married again. Morty bought a house for my mom, hoping they could build a family together. However, my mom had other plans. Whenever I visited her, which was rare, I always found my mom on her phone, laughing and talking to someone without a care in the world. She'd only hang up when it was time for Morty to come home. Apparently, Morty eventually found out she'd been cheating on him with another guy and they had a huge fight. However, my mom managed to convince him it was a one-time mistake, so they stayed together. During this time, my father's health wasn't improving. In his final days, he spent as much time with me as he could. I'd come home from school terrified something had happened to him. Unfortunately, one night, my father passed away in his sleep after months of chemotherapy that didn't work. My grandmother and my father's family were the first to reach out to me as I couldn't stop crying. When my mom came, she was alone with no sign of Morty. I didn't know it then, but my mom had continued talking to the other guy behind Morty's back, and he eventually left her. At my father's funeral, my mom kept saying how his death couldn't have come at a worse time because she was already dealing with so much. Everyone was shocked and irritated by her lack of sensitivity. When my father's will was revealed, It stated that all his assets would pass to me immediately. My mother suddenly seemed very interested in being back in my life. However, my grandmother didn't want me living with her because she knew what kind of daughter she had raised. She knew my mom wanted me for the money my dad had left for me. My grandmother and aunt helped me sell all my father's assets so they could open a college trust fund in my name. However, since I was still a minor, my mother's name also had to be added. Meanwhile, Morty, my mom's husband, divorced her during this period. And since they didn't have a prenuptial agreement, she ended up with a substantial settlement. That's why my grandmother warned her not to touch my funds, emphasizing that she already had her own money. My mom agreed to this arrangement. When my mom and I started living together, at first, it felt like I was living with a stranger. She had changed so much over the years and not for the better. All she did was behave like a teenager. She'd dress up and go out every night. She'd come home late at night with strange men and take them to her room. Every morning, I'd walk into the kitchen and notice someone different. It became a daily routine. When I turned 16, my mom introduced me to her third husband, Joy. From the beginning, it was clear he didn't like me. His behavior toward me was cruel and unnecessarily critical. Whenever I brought up the issue with my mom, she'd confront him, which only led to even more covert hostility behind her back. Then when my brother came along 10 months later, my mom's narrative shifted to paint Joy as a good person deep down who just struggled to express himself. I was encouraged not to resent him, but to be more understanding. However, Joy had no problem showing love to my little brother, Brad. Ironically, my mom confided in me several times that she had nothing in common with Joy, but had married him because he'd provide us with a stable family. This was far from the truth because my mom and Joy would have nasty fights, especially after Brad was born. Joy didn't want my mom spending time with me and would yell at her if she wasn't around Brad. He used to say things like, he wished I had died with my dad, or that I should go live with my grandma because he wanted his son to get all the love and attention. It was painful and mentally exhausting to live with him, where it was clear I wasn't welcome. Every time I begged or questioned my mom about why she stayed with him, she skillfully avoided the topic. One day, my mom and Joy left us at my grandma's so they could go out with their mutual friends and have fun. At first, this started as a once or twice a month thing, but it became almost every weekend. Usually, they asked me to take care of Brad while they were out, but that night, I was studying for my exam, so they left both of us at my grandma's house. I loved spending time with her, and she would usually cook really delicious meals for me while I could study in peace. Brad was playing with his toys on the living room floor. My grandma had strictly told my parents they needed to be back by 11 to pick us up. However, even after 11 p.m., my parents hadn't returned. I started to worry since I had exams the next day and also needed to get Brad to bed on time. Otherwise, Joy would yell at me. Meanwhile, my grandma kept calling and leaving angry messages for my parents. By midnight, Joy and my mom finally showed up in their car, completely drunk and laughing like teenagers. They reeked of alcohol, and we were shocked they even managed to drive there without getting caught. Joy went to pick up Brad while my mom asked me to gather my things so we could drive back. However, my grandma stood her ground. She yelled at them for showing up so late and also for being so drunk, which was dangerous for all of us. She told Joy he couldn't take his son in that state and that we should call an Uber for ourselves and leave the car at her house. However, Joy started arguing with my grandma, telling her to mind her own business and that he was the father, so he knew what was best for his son. Tensions quickly escalated. With heated exchanges of curses between my grandma and Joy, my mom stood silently on the side saying nothing, clearly drunk and unable to process anything. I could feel the tension rising, so I begged them to stop, reminding them they were scaring my brother. But my words fell on deaf ears. The shouting persisted, and Joy started hurling insults at my grandma and me, saying we had never liked him but tolerated him for my mom's sake. This enraged my grandma further, and in a burst of frustration, she threatened to call the police. Upon hearing this, Joy, clearly drunk and yelling like a maniac, did the worst thing I've ever seen anyone do. He slapped my grandma. I screamed in horror as Joy's hand struck my grandma's face, the sound echoing through the room. "Stop! Just stop!" I screamed. But Joy didn't even look at me while Brad began crying, clearly traumatized. My grandma, holding her cheek, yelled at me to call the police while my mom stood frozen in shock. I don't even remember what I said to the 911 operator as I was crying too much. Fortunately, the person understood and stayed on the call with me until the police arrived. When Joy noticed the approaching sirens, panic crossed his face. Suddenly, he began pleading with my grandma, desperation in his eyes. He begged her not to press charges, insisting it would ruin his life and my mom's too. In the end, Joy was charged with assault and taken away in handcuffs. He kept pleading with my mom to help him pay bail, but my mom, who had been frozen before, started crying and yelling at him. My grandma made it clear to my mom that if she didn't divorce that man, she would involve Child Protective Services, and she would lose both her kids. My mom simply nodded, clearly terrified. Only later did I learn that Joy and my mom had also been doing drugs that night along with drinking. The reason my mom wasn't arrested that night was because she had mostly stayed quiet, unlike Joy. That night, Brad and I stayed at my grandma's house because I refused to be with my mom alone as I was so disappointed and traumatized. Fortunately, the next day, when my mom sobered up, she realized what her husband had done. She filed for divorce and forbade him from ever seeing us again. When the rest of the family learned what Joy had done, they all came down on my mom, and rightfully so. Everyone had questions, and rightfully so. Why had it taken my mom so long to act? Why didn't she see the signs earlier? My aunt and uncle yelled at my mom until she started crying. They were so angry that they vowed never to speak to her again for what her husband had done. Regarding Joy's charges, since it was his first offense, the court put him on probation. During this period, Joy had to attend therapy and was ordered to stay away from us. He could only see his son if my mom allowed it and if she was present as well. He tried begging my mom to forgive him, but she didn't listen and divorced his manipulative ass. She got a lot from him in the settlement and has been living a good life since then. I didn't want to stay with my mom after the incident with Joy, so I moved all my stuff to my grandma's house while Brad stayed with my mom. My mom didn't like this arrangement at all, as she relied on me to take care of my brother, but she couldn't say anything for fear of my grandma scolding her. This year, I celebrated my 18th birthday. I was so excited to finally be an adult and start a new chapter in my life. However, life had other plans for me. My grandma passed away just a week after my birthday. She had a heart attack, and it was completely unexpected as she had no heart issues. After her funeral, the entire family was in shock. I found out she had written a will to divide her assets. For my mom and my aunt, she had evenly split her jewelry and family heirlooms, which were quite expensive. For her eldest son, my uncle, she left her car, which he had always loved. For my cousins, she divided her money to be deposited into their college trust funds. For me, she left her most valuable asset, her house. Apparently, because I was the closest to my grandma among everyone and had been living with her, she didn't want me to go back to my mom's house ever again. I was shocked and started crying tears of joy as her house held so many happy memories for me. Unfortunately, my grandma didn't leave anything for Brad. I'm not sure if she simply forgot or if it was because Brad was just my half-brother. Needless to say, my mom was furious with my grandma. She clearly stated that giving me a house was worth far more than her jewelry, and it just wasn't fair for her mother to leave me so much. No one except my mother had any complaints since everyone understood that my grandmother had left us with things we all deserved. Later, my mother got upset because Brad didn't receive anything and started speaking poorly about my grandmother, calling her selfish for not doing anything for her son. I got angry and told her she should be grateful that her mother decided to leave her anything after what her ex-husband did to her. Hearing this, my mother got furious, saying I had no right to bring up the past, which made me scoff at her. Then she began telling me how I should sell my grandmother's house and move in with her. I told her that I truly loved staying in the house and would never sell it because it meant more to me than money. My mother tried to push me further, but I stood my ground. I must say it's been wonderful living on my own. I've always been surrounded by toxic people until I permanently moved into my grandmother's house and have never lived alone before. However, I've been spending a lot of time by myself and going to therapy to deal with my grandmother's death. With everything going on in my life, I decided to take a gap year. But since I'm no longer a minor, I wanted to remove my mother from my trust fund. I needed her signature to access the funds and also to remove her as a beneficiary. So, 2 months ago, I went to speak with my mother. She introduced me to her new boyfriend, Robbie, whom she'd been dating for a few weeks. Robbie seemed like a nice guy, though quite a bit younger than her, unlike all her previous ex-husbands. However, I knew better than to mention his age. I asked my mom if we could talk privately, and she agreed. I hoped things would go well regarding my trust fund since this was legitimately the money my dad had left me. However, my mother started to panic when she heard I wanted to remove her from the trust. I found it odd, and I told her this had always been the plan, and now that I was 18, I'd like to manage my own finances. She refused, saying I was still young, and since I wasn't going to college this year anyway, I didn't need to remove her. Her behavior started raising my suspicions, but my mother kept insisting I could always come to her when I began college later. I spent some time with Brad and left. It wasn't until I was driving back home that I realized there was a possibility my mother had been using the trust money. Although it seemed unlikely at the time, I decided to consult a lawyer who could help me understand the terms and conditions of the trust document. The lawyer reviewed it and agreed that my mother needed to sign for me to access the funds. However, I could see its current value if necessary. That's how I found out from the bank what my mother had been doing. Not only had she been withdrawing money from the trust fund in small amounts over the years, but after our recent conversation, she had completely drained the account. I was horrified. It felt like the ground had collapsed beneath my feet. The betrayal was too much. I was so angry about what my mother had done. For days, I cried and wandered around the house. No wonder she didn't want me to remove her access to the funds. I knew that if I confronted her about it, she'd either deny it or come up with some absurd excuse. I felt like I needed to teach her a lesson. Just as luck would have it, my mother, who had no idea I knew about her betrayal, called to inform me she was getting married again. She was excitedly talking about how Robbie was definitely the one, which was funny because he was the fourth one. I almost rolled my eyes since it was the same thing I'd heard from her about every guy. She told me how she was going to have a big wedding to celebrate her love with Robbie. I just wanted to scream at her and scold her for being such a horrible mother and stealing my money, but I held my tongue because I wanted revenge. Since she was going to have a wedding, it gave me the perfect opportunity to plan. I decided to have a family meeting to gather all my trusted cousins and relatives for what I was about to do. I told them everything and showed them documents detailing how my mother had been withdrawing money from my college trust fund, which contained all the money my dad had left me, and how she had completely drained it once she knew she'd no longer have access. When I shared this, my family's disbelief mirrored mine when I first discovered the truth. I told them how the timing of her wedding seemed suspicious, and how she'd probably stolen my money for her lavish wedding, and I wanted to humiliate her at the event before having her arrested. My uncles were horrified that my mother could stoop so low and promised to support me. My cousins also agreed with my plan. My mother's wedding was last week. She had invited the whole family to her church wedding and the big reception with Robbie. I decided to attend the wedding wearing a t-shirt that had the words, "My mother is a gold digger," in bright red letters. I had this shirt custom made specifically for this occasion. Seeing my outfit, Robbie and his family looked shocked while I just politely smiled and went to find my seat. My side of the family already knew my plan, so they were prepared. When my mother, oblivious to my intentions, began walking down the aisle, I remained seated. She didn't even look at me as she passed by, so it seemed like my plan was working. During the ceremony, when the priest asked if anyone objected to the couple's union, I knew it was my moment. I raised my hand in objection. The priest looked surprised. However, along with me, my aunt, uncle, and cousins also raised their hands. My mother and Robbie looked at us in horror as I got up from my seat. My mother finally noticed the words on my t-shirt, and her face turned red with embarrassment in front of the gathered guests. I publicly accused my mother of stealing money from my college trust fund. Holding up documents, I laid out the details of her betrayal, emphasizing that she had stolen funds my late father had left me, leaving me without the means to attend college. Her face went pale as whispers spread among the guests. Then, I loudly asked why she would steal money from her own daughter when she'd already been married 3 times and received more than enough alimony from her previous marriages. The room filled with gasps as Robbie turned to my mother, clearly unaware of her actions. He asked her what I meant by 3 marriages when she had only ever told him about one. My mother glared at me furiously and started yelling about how childish I was, claiming she hadn't stolen any of my money. She said she had every right to the money since she had been married to my father and told me I should be grateful that I was even born. I shouted back at her, saying what she had done was illegal and that I would ensure she was arrested. However, my mother scoffed and called me ungrateful, insisting it wasn't a big deal since she had practically raised me and that the least I could do was let her have the money. She argued that she had every right to my money. That's when Robbie intervened. He asked my mother if that was how they had been able to afford such an extravagant wedding, given that my mother was paying for everything. My mother stayed silent, which was essentially an admission. That's when everything spiraled out of control. I couldn't contain my anger and began yelling at her. The chaos escalated as my relatives joined in, berating her for her despicable actions. Amid the shouting, my mother retaliated, insisting that it was a private matter between her and me and that they shouldn't judge her for it. Things turned physical when my aunt got too close while confronting her, which led to pushing between the two of them. The chaos reached its peak, prompting someone to call the police. Eventually, my mother was arrested because she kept yelling and refused to calm down when the police arrived. I went to the station with my aunt to give my statement. Since then, my mother has been charged with embezzlement and financial fraud. I still can't believe it even as I write this because I never thought I'd actually get my mother arrested. I can't believe she would do something like this to me. Since her wedding, I've been getting calls from everyone, both out of concern and indignation. Some of my distant relatives think I went too far and should never have involved others in this matter or had my mother arrested. My side of the family believes I did the right thing. However, this is such an extraordinary circumstance that I'm forced to wonder if I went too far with my mother. Update 1. Thank you all for your kind words. When I posted this, I was overthinking and feeling really guilty as I never truly hated my mom, or at least I didn't until she stole from me. I never wanted to file a lawsuit against her, and it still feels like I'm living in a nightmare. However, I understand that these are all consequences of her own action. To everyone concerned about me, please don't worry. My uncle helped me find a good lawyer who's confident will win this legal case against my mom. My only goal is to recover my lost money, or at least as much as I can. Also, for those wondering about Brad, he's doing fine. He's still too young to understand what's happening. For now, he's staying with Joy and her family since my mom's arrest. As for Robbie, I guess he won't be marrying her after all. Update 2. It's been 6 months since my last update. I know many of you have been wondering what happened, and I'd like to clarify that I wasn't allowed to speak or write anything about the case while the legal proceedings were ongoing. In short, the court ruled in my favor. My mother has been ordered to return every cent of the money she stole from me. She cried and begged, but the judge didn't budge. She now has to liquidate all her assets and will likely have to sell her house to pay me back. It feels so good to write this because these past months have been brutal on my mental health. The only thing that has kept me going is thinking of my grandmother and dad. My grandmother would be proud that I stood up to my mom, and my dad would have wanted me to get his money back to invest in my future. Update 3. It's been 3 months since my last update here. How was the new year for everyone? Mine was fantastic. My mother, now facing the consequences of her actions, has fully repaid the amount she embezzled from my college trust fund. The legal proceedings forced her to make amends, at least financially. I also made the difficult decision to permanently cut ties with my mother. The rest of my family shares this sentiment, and we've collectively decided to distance ourselves from her despite her attempts to reach out as if she expects us to forgive and forget this incident. Lately, I've been looking through brochures and thinking about what 2024 will bring. The gap year has turned out to be incredible overall. Despite the legal proceedings, it's been a mix of self-discovery and healing from past traumas. Spending time with my cousins and other family members has been a big part of moving forward. Update 4. I don't know if it's surprising or not, but my mother has decided to get married again. This is her 5th victim. Though, to be fair, it will be her 4th marriage because Robbie dodged a bullet thanks to my revenge. It's clear I'm not invited because I already ruined one wedding for her, and she's not taking the risk again. But I know many other family members won't be attending either. First, because they want nothing to do with her. And second, because it doesn't make much sense. She'll likely have another one in a few years as usual. I should add that I've started college and plan to study medicine. I know it's challenging, but I love helping people, and I'm going to give it my